Hello all, this is our second week lecture in week one. It's about the Women's Rights Convention that took place in 1848 and the Dred Scott case, both of which, as I said in my last lecture, are going to address two groups that are left out by our founding documents. In the middle of the 19th century, women would make a call for their own civil rights, including the right to vote. In addition, Dred Scott would attempt to argue that slaves were freed just by living in free states. So let's look at these two events in our class. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls. As I mentioned in my last lecture, women would have gained no appreciable rights from the American Revolution. And that's important to note because it's not like there was no call for rights. Abigail Adams wrote to her husband on March 31st of 1776, "I long to hear that you have declared independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire that you remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." These are strong words that Abigail wrote, but unfortunately, as I said, her husband and the delegates did not listen, and they paid no attention to the ladies. They still were completely held by their husband, including inability to own property. So an important idea of the 19th century that I want to talk about for a little bit is separate spheres. In the 19th century, the idea of separate spheres comes to prominence, and it kind of sees the world as existing in two planes. There's the domestic sphere and the public sphere. And the public sphere was the male domain, and the domestic sphere was the female domain. So this was both freeing and problematic for women in particular. One, it was freeing for them because it states their authority within the domestic sphere. And that may seem obvious, but in earlier colonial periods, men were actually in charge of things like making sure the household finances were correct and raising the children. And this gives women a little more domain within their domestic sphere. But it's limiting because it limits women from the public sphere. It limits women from a call for their own civil and legal rights. And this is so important that when the Women's Rights Convention was originally formed, the president was not a woman. And the idea of women's right to vote was actually radical even within the convention itself. So I'm going to read just a part of the Declaration of Sentiments, which you're going to notice is patterned after the Declaration of Independence that I discussed in my first lecture. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, and that are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted deriving from their powers the consent of the governed. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world." So what they did was two things. They started with restating the Declaration of Independence to include women, and then they go on to say that women are being held down by men, and that's really important. And then they list grievances, ways in which men were limiting the rights of women, important civil rights which this convention is arguing are as inalienable as any civil right. So as I said, the idea of the right to vote was one of these ideas, and that was extremely controversial for a couple reasons. One, people believed that it would cause havoc within the marriage. So what if men and women wanted to vote on issues differently? That would bring strife into the domestic sphere and the home. Two, some felt that women were already represented by their husbands. And even if that were true, it doesn't address women who didn't have husbands but were of legal voting age. Some of the women at the convention were not sure if they were asking too much, and some said that this would make a mockery to declare for the right to vote, and that one of the turning points was actually Frederick Douglass, who was an experienced orator, and he spoke up in favor of women's right to vote. And he said that women could not advocate for their own civil rights unless they had participation in the government and the right to change the government. Basically saying that women would never achieve real civil rights unless they have the right to vote. And I think that Frederick Douglass, not only in this speech, but in other speeches he makes about African American enfranchisement, really highlights how important the right to vote is, and how he understood that as maybe the most important civil right. Okay, so a little less than 10 years later is the Dred Scott case in 1857. You'll notice this is still 4 years before the start of the Civil War and 8 years before the end of the Civil War. So the main argument that Dred Scott makes in his case is that he spent time in the Wisconsin Territory as a slave, and because slavery is not allowed in the Wisconsin Territory, that made him free. Okay, so this was a very important case because the idea of slavery had been dividing our country since really the writing of the Declaration of Independence. Some drafts of the Declaration of Independence include talking about slavery and freedom, and slave owners did not want that included because they had concerns that clear connections would be drawn between their own slaves. Also was a debate in the Constitution about how to include slaves in the Constitution, how they be counted in population for the vote. So this is an idea that had been dividing our country literally since the very beginning. Scott's wife, Harriet Scott, had encouraged her husband to file the case. He had already tried to purchase his own freedom, and they was declined. And I think one of the interesting things is, and you have to remember that this would not have been a true jury of his peers because African Americans could not necessarily serve on a jury, but the case was originally decided in his favor by a jury, that it was decided that a slave who spent time basically in a free territory or a free state did automatically become free. And I think you can imagine how that would upset slave owners who were concerned that this was going to take their freedom to own slaves. That this was going to, freedom's not a good word, this was going to impinge upon what they felt like was their property owning rights. But then it's turned over by the state Supreme Court, and eventually it makes its way up to the Supreme Court, and Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, who was a strong supporter of slavery, wrote the major opinion in this case. He supported slavery. And he argued that the Missouri Compromise of 1820 actually deprived citizens of their property by prohibiting slavery in some states. Um, so this is really important because this is the first time since Marbury versus Madison in 1803 that an act of Congress was declared unconstitutional. Marbury versus Madison sets the precedence that the Supreme Court can declare laws and acts of Congress unconstitutional. And this is the second time that that's done. And that's important for both sides of the slavery debate. Because on one hand, he's saying that slave owners can travel to free states and they can continue to own their slaves, that right cannot be taken from them. But more importantly, in the end, he's saying that the federal government has no right to declare a state free, and almost that it has no right to make free territories, and it has no jurisdiction over this idea of national law about slavery. And as you can imagine, that upset many Northerners. It also ruled that Dred Scott lacked citizenship, as did all slaves. So in the end, Chief Justice Taney said that Dred Scott could not even bring case in the federal in the court system because he was not a citizen. So these civil rights apply to citizens of our country, and this idea of citizenship is going to continue to be extremely important. So in some ways, these two early ideas we're looking at are questioning whether women and African Americans were even citizens of America. And we're not even going to discuss until a little later in our class that Native Americans are another group that's completely left out of citizenship and is not protected by any of these civil rights that we're defining in the early weeks. And that's a really important idea. We can see that not all people supported the Dred Scott case. Many spoke out against it, including Abraham Lincoln, who wrote this in a letter to Joshua Speed about the Dred Scott case. I'm just going to play a little clip from the Civil War by Ken Burns discussing Abraham Lincoln's quote.
In 1857, the Supreme Court refused to free a slave, Dred Scott, even though he had lived for many years on free soil. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney said a black man had no rights a white man was bound to respect.
As a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. Soon, it will read all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. When it comes to this, I should prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. To Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy. Abraham Lincoln.
So I think those words are really important to understand, that not everyone agreed with what was going on. In our class, we're going to spend a lot of time looking at civil rights, but not only civil rights, but injustices done to people to remove them of their civil rights. And I hope we're always going to look at that and also look at the opposition and know that people were fighting and did not think that this was good. So my conclusion is that, we looked in the first lecture this week at how the civil rights were laid out in the early roots of our country. In my second lecture this week, we're looking at who was denied civil rights. We're looking that women were denied the right to vote. They were denied the legal right to own property. They were denied many of their base rights, as were African Americans, who were still held in bondage until after the Civil War. And that this is, it's important to recognize our civil rights, but to also recognize the groups that are left out. And as I said also earlier, that Native Americans are not even being discussed as citizens of our country at this point. So, my last slide, as always, is my reference slide. I hope that you guys will check out some of the information on Dred Scott. I also included a biography of Abigail Adams in case you're interested in her early fight for women's rights and her thoughts on that. Also, I only got to talk about her briefly, but Dred Scott's wife is actually very important and a strong example of the strive for civil rights early on. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.